for joining us to celebrate the launch of Deesha Philyaw's triumphant collection of short stories, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. Hello, I'm Stephanie Flom, Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. Welcome. This program is part of our Made Local series, produced with Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Thank you to the library and to White Whale Bookstore, where you can purchase copies of Deesha's book. We are thrilled that Deesha is joined in conversation with Khirsten Scott. Khirsten is Assistant Professor of English Composition at the University of Pittsburgh and co-founder of DBLAC, a mentorship network offering writing support for Black scholars. She is working on her first book, which looks at published histories of historically Black colleges and universities for inclusion of student writing. Deesha Philyaw's writing on race, parenting, gender, and culture has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, McSweeney's, The Rumpus, Brevity, and elsewhere. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies has been called triumphant by Publishers Weekly, tender, fierce, and proudly Black and beautiful by Kirkus Reviews, and is predicted by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette to be selected by Oprah's Book Club before the end of the year. Pittsburgh Current laws Deesha's telling of stories full of humanity, warmth, and compassion. Please welcome Khirsten Scott and Deesha Philyaw.
Hi, so glad to be in conversation with you today about your collection of short stories, The Secret Life of Church Ladies. It was such a treat. I actually completed all 9 short stories in one sitting. It was the highlight of my quarantine struggles. And so I laughed, I cried, I really reflected and saw myself and so many other folks that I know in these stories and in these secrets. And so I'm really excited to talk with you and learn a bit more about the writing process and just you. So let's start there. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself as a writer and your motivations and or inspiration for this collection?
Yes. So my first writing impulse was fiction, and that would have been in, say, the early 2000s. And I don't have a writing background. I don't have writing degrees or anything like that. But I've always enjoyed writing and storytelling. And you're a daughter of the South too, so we tell stories. We don't know short stories. Everything is long. So hope we can keep this in the time frame. But I've always liked to tell stories. And so in the early 2000s, I was actually a stay-at-home mom. At that time, I had one child, and that's how I would kind of steal a little time for myself. And then over time, just looking for different publishing opportunities, I ended up writing a parenting related column for a site called Literary Mama. And so that's how I got pulled into the personal essay nonfiction world. And, fiction was just always sort of something on the side. There were a couple of, bad novels I tried to write over time, and, still writing short stories here and there. But really, the personal essay world just opened up a writing career for me, because then I started writing for places like the Washington Post, and it was all focused around parenting, race, gender, things like that. And then my first book was actually a book I co-authored with my ex-husband and co-parent, and it's a book about co-parenting. And so I was always, sort of pining away for fiction while all of that was happening, and not came back to really, but I guess in 2007, started a novel that, that isn't terrible, but it was in fits and starts, and, with all of the personal essay parenting stuff going on. And then I have an agent from the co-parenting book, and she knew that I was working on a novel. And so she said, when you're ready for that novel, we can make that happen. And it was not happening. And so I was still writing these short stories, and my agent would come and hear me read the short stories. And finally, after one of the events, one of the readings, she said, these stories with these church ladies, they're really great. And while you're kind of on hiatus from that novel, for the last decade, maybe you could do a short story collection with these church lady stories. And at that time, I hadn't really thought of it as church lady stories, but these were just the stories that, came to my mind. But at that point, at her suggestion, I got really intentional about writing a collection or series of stories that all had church ladies or people that I call church lady adjacent, that there's a church lady in their life who is influential. And so where they came from initially, I think it's just, they just live in my memories because I grew up in the church. And I watched church ladies a lot. I was very curious about them. And they just kind of stuck with me. And so when I started imagining and thinking about situations or people or questions, they were the ones that popped up and initially, and then I just sort of ran with it.
Oh no, I love that, especially the relationship between memory and recall, and even like nostalgic retelling stories to really kind of cast larger critiques or considerations for the larger culture. And so, what I'm curious about, you mentioned that you grew up in the church and you had these experiences with church ladies. What were they like in your direct memory, not from the piece that you
Sure.
Were you aspiring to be a church lady? Was that a aspiration that manifested, one that you departed from?
Right. I never felt like there was, that was my future, because I saw them as like really good and really holy. And so and as an adolescent, preteen and into my early teen years, and going through puberty and things like that, I'm like, do they like sex? Do they think about sex? Do they masturbate? I had sort of divorced them from any kind of sex or sexuality. And so it was very perplexing to me, what were their lives like? And so I did not see, I saw them as like a template of what I could be, but then I also saw women who were outside of the church. And so I felt like those were my choices. Binaries are not our friends, but yet that's what we're often presented with. And so I was not sure. And so it was kind of a bit of a, secrets of my own of like, well, I know I want to go to heaven. Well, or mostly I don't want to go to hell. And so, I'm like over here, but these women outside of church, they have a lot more fun. So, and then, that's a kid's eye view, right? And so then when you become an adult, you realize that, life is not black and white and our choices are not that neat, and people are complex and people have secrets and people have contradictions and it's really messy, but I like that messiness. And so, so that's what I chose to kind of focus on, those lives, the interior lives of those women that I didn't know their interior lives when I was a kid observing them. And so then I imagined them. And then, my own struggles and secrets, they're in the book too. So.
Awesome. So you recently facilitated a talk at Chatham University, here in Pittsburgh, about the ethics of telling other people's stories and journeys.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about the ethical considerations you took in, as you just said, in weaving in your own secrets, those from the past. What process did you engage as you thought through what you would share, how you would share it, what relationship it had with folks who you may still be in contact with or not, or even the larger Black community or the Black church community? What kind of considerations went into that process of sharing and curating the stories?
Right. So the talk that you're referring to, the title, First Do No Harm. And so I use that measure for myself. I don't want to harm anyone in the process of telling stories. And so there aren't characters that, where I would say somebody would say, "Ooh, that's me." Deesha wrote about me. Except maybe there's some elements in there of my mother, but my mother has passed away, and so and so nobody but my mother would know which parts are my mother. There are lots of mothers in the stories, so my mother wouldn't be able. She's not here to see that. But I didn't. Feel the need to tell anybody's story directly and then just sort of like dress it up with fiction. It was nothing. It was more just elements of things or conflicts that I knew of. And, and then I built a character around that conflict, or there's a personality that I was really drawn to. That's my job as a writer, is to amp up the drama, and make it even more interesting. I'll say this. So the Dear Sister story is semi-autobiographical. I do have 4 sisters, and we there was one that we contacted after our father died. We had never had contact with her before. But the sisters in the story, I combine traits of my different sisters. So I have a sister who's a nurse, but she's not like Tashida, so things like that. So, and that sister has read the book and she liked it, and she didn't, have any issues with how the nurse was portrayed, because she knew that's not her. So I played with the interesting bits and pieces. And so I don't feel like any real people were harmed in the making of this book. So that's sort of my standard. And also in that talk, I talk about these questions as this is how we need to approach writing stories that aren't ours, as to be as good literary citizens. And so it's making sure that we aren't doing harm, and making sure that we're making informed decisions. Because if you don't know the context of what you're writing and who you're writing about, you won't know if you're doing harm or not. You don't know what you don't know. And so you're really needing to interrogate that. And so I'm pretty sure that, that I did my due diligence with that, because, the vast majority of this is purely imagination and not necessarily inspired by, one person or anything like that. Composites of people and situations, sure.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that drew me in. I never quite identified with any one character or could map it onto someone else, but I was so invested. I wanted more from each character. I wanted to see how their stories were unfolding, and there was a beautiful synergy and conversation happening across the women. And I want to get into that a bit more at the second half of the interview. And what I'm curious about is why the church as the site. So I know you talked about your agent, and you mentioned that these stories could be associated with anyone, right? We could think about these as just women in a community or women in an apartment building. I'm thinking about girls. I'm thinking about how we construct groups and societal orders, whether it be a sorority or a book club or just any gathering, that this could have been associated. Why the critique and the place of the church as the site? And what work do you think that's doing in this current moment, where we are perhaps, for some people, thinking about the relevance of the church, thinking about the relevance of storytelling within the church, or even resisting some of those binaries of like you're in the church or you're outside of the church?
I think because I've experienced in my own life and with other Black women that I know, that even if you've never been in the church, the Black church still has influence because your mother was in the church or her mother was in the church. And so a lot of the challenges that we have, and again, those binaries and the ways we construct our sexuality and how we respond to our desires, even if we never step foot in a church, there's still that, it can still loom over what we see as our options, or what we see as what it means to be good or right, or what is sexually healthy, or what is allowed. And so there's this, the church's influence, I knew was prevalent for me and for other women who just sort of struggle with these notions and desire. One of the things that we're taught in church is, the flesh is weak, and so if you start with that premise, and our flesh is everywhere, it's not just in our flesh, like it's our literal bodies. If you're starting with the premise that that's weak, that's a lifetime of unlearning that you have to do. And so I saw the church as a place that taught us many things, directly or indirectly. And for those of us who are trying to get free, there's, your life becomes a process of unlearning those things that don't serve any of us well. And then with women, church women in particular, I'm just really interested in the dynamic that Black churches has, majority women. I mean, we just outnumber the men vastly, but not in leadership. But we're present, and we're present in larger numbers, but it's the men that are still setting the tone by and large. I mean, obviously there are exceptions. So I'm really fascinated by how we cling to, and of course, church fathers, the people who wrote the books of the Bible. So there's all of this male influence on this predominantly female group of people. And that's just extraordinary to me. And so I wanted to explore the ramifications of that and what happens when we don't unlearn, what happens when we start trying to unlearn, but there's some resistance, fear. There's so much fear at the root of how we're taught in traditional evangelical Christianity, fear of hell, fear of, condemnation. And we know that fear is just no way to live. And so I also wanted to play with, what do women do because they're afraid? And then what would they do if they were no longer afraid?
With that, I really want to, kind of segue into the stories and talk about this concept of vulnerability. The vulnerability attached with sharing a story. So I think there's a certain vulnerability as a writer that you inhabit as you, compose and curate these stories into a collection. But if we were to imagine that these church ladies were telling their stories in response to that fear that you just described, in response to the really hegemonic orders of the church that really kind of place women at the margins or just invisibly, doing this work behind the scenes, what level of vulnerability goes into even imagining telling your story or thinking through your story as critique or as healing? Some women never get to that point where they see the value of that they see that it may even harm them more, to kind of circle back to your do no harm piece. And if we are to tell stories and understand the power of storytelling in the church, what role do you think vulnerability plays in women being able to share their secrets as a way to build and grow and unlearn, as you said, those church ways?
That's a tough one. And I think about the other part of your prior question about the larger role of church in sort of this present moment. And I was doing an interview and someone sent me the questions in advance, and I'm glad they did, because they're like, we're in this present moment and the Black church is leading the way. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, that was the civil rights movement, like I dare I say that the church is a little silent right now. And so I think that, we have this history of the church as a place, as a cornerstone of our struggle, collective struggle for liberation, but not necessarily for personal liberation, and specifically not for women. I think it can be that way. And I would love it, if my book could usher that in, so that, when women are reading these stories, that they realize that there are things to unlearn. And I'm taking this great course right now on sex and faith. And one of the things that I'm learning in that class is that there are your faith and then there are beliefs, and your beliefs are what can be harmful and unhealthy. But you don't have to abandon your faith just to, to work through and do the unlearning. You can unlearn harmful beliefs and still have your faith intact. And so I think that that churches and individuals within churches who can do that work and coming alongside women and just really looking with a critical lens at what is our church teaching, what historically, and then, in individual churches now, like what messages are we sending? And often it's a lot of it is implicit. And, you have the background, that there's so many things that were never like hammered into us explicitly, but we knew. Yep. We knew who was shamed. We knew who, when their name was mentioned, there was that look and that, what I mean? So there's a lot that's communicated indirectly. And so a lot of unspoken rules and things like that. And so I think that the church as a place of liberation, if we can get back to that, and really look at the harm that has been done. And, let's first be honest about that. And then collectively be a place where people get free of that. Individually, though, that so many of us have done that work on our own. But I think the church absolutely can have that role. It's just a matter of willingness. And some churches do. I mean, I'm talking about the Black church. And so it's more traditional, but we know that, there's liberation theology. We know that there are churches that embrace queer folks. And so, they've kind of set the tone for others to follow.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that response, because one thing that I felt as I read the 9 short stories was that the church becomes a character, whether stated or unstated. And it was so central to the construction of most everything, whether it was a, periphery reference, or if it was just central, as in with like Eula, where we know that we are critiquing the church from the beginning. That's the first story. Yeah. Know exactly what's happening. But one thing that I'm thinking about as a battle for church constructions, and I also resist the idea of the Black church, that, to kind of go back to a comment you made earlier about binaries, that we have to resist these ideas of either or, right? That you can't have faith and pleasure, that you can't have faith and freedom, that there has to be room for us to occupy those spaces. And I think for Black women and Black girls, as you've mentioned here, we have been enculturated to believe things, and that unlearning process is uncomfortable, right? It's something that is not taught. It's often something that's not modeled, and so you begin to do what you've seen. And so I think specifically about the NAP ministry. I don't know if you're familiar with the NAP ministry and how there was this idea of grind culture, and I felt that was in conversation with what I was reading here. This idea of, why did I aspire to be so present in the church? What were my examples? And so I really want to get into a few of the stories that stood out to me with that piece. And so I want to just start with Eula, because Eula opens us up. And, as I listen to my memories as I read this story, I thought about Audre Lorde and the power of the erotic, and how, so many women writ large, but specifically Black women, have not embraced the politics and the practice of pleasure. And so there's a lot of unknown possibilities and unknown desires that then become kind of masked and fueled by the church. And so I'm curious about how you decided that this would be the opening story. It was brief. It hooked you right in. And when I think about the audiences that may engage this, if this is the first story that you know, it's about to go down. Right? You're not holding back. And Corletta, I was like, I'm here for you, because we got different prayers. We in this together, but we're praying for different things. And there's so many realities in any relationship. And so just curious about the role of sex, desire, the erotic, and holding place for both your faith and pleasure as a possibility.
Sure. So first, I want to give a shout out to Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Pleasure Activism. And she talks about, and actually, I think she reprints in full Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic. And so this idea of the erotic as life force for women, for women. And so, her work is just incredible. And her work is a curation of many voices and many practices. And so I read that after the collection was done, but I felt like, I hope that this collection can be a part of that movement of towards pleasure. Eula in particular. So initially, it's a multi-part answer. Eula was the first story that I had published elsewhere. In Apogee Journal, it was published. And so part of it was initially like, I want to celebrate the fact that, that was the first story and the first publication that, said, this is good, because it had gotten rejected. So that was the sort of the easy answer. But then you've alluded to it a bit too. I kind of wanted it to be as one reviewer said, I wanted to snatch everybody's edges in the very beginning, so that if you are someone who's maybe uncomfortable around or uncomfortable reading about explicit sex or reading about queer people, then you know right away, like, this is what this book is, and where we can, so it wasn't like a building up to it or anything like that. And also because I don't feel like I need to like ease people into it. Like, this is real life. We're all grown. We all had sex before, and so I wanted to, and the attention, it is a attention grabber, just in general. So that was my thought behind that.
I really also like the attention to age, that you see their relationship building over decades, and how many women have held these secrets for so long, and experience and just kind of deprive themselves of that pleasure experience for that long, for some hope that may never come, but that they truly already be experiencing. And so I thought that was one of the, it did snatch my edges. I can't. I was laughing at the shade, and I was reflecting, how many women have been in erotic, willing relationships where there was no sexual requirement or expectation, but that you really felt attached and loving and caring towards another woman. That is a politic that has not been fully embraced. I believe in the church site is a site where it is maybe being overlooked, and this may usher conversation for that. So I saw that it's definitely a companion text. And then, as I got deeper into things, the Dear Sister was messy, just messy. So I loved all the moments where she was trying to reinsert the estranged sister back in, like, and this is your uncle too, and don't forget you're in this family. So I love that mess. But Peach Cobbler, I wanted to talk about the human nature of the church, and trying to bring people down from these pedestals and godlike presentations, and kind of talk through, how that humanity element is coming through in all the stories, but particularly there, where we are trying to make man more human instead of being godlike. So how were you grappling with the politics and kind of ethics of telling that story?
I didn't want there to be villains, right? And so that's part of it. And I know you're asking about, bringing them down in a different kind of way, but it is that putting people on pedestals, and then because we put them on a pedestal, when they act human, like they're going to, then we're afraid to do anything about it because we put them on this pedestal, as opposed to, let's just not put them on pedestals. How about that? So that they can be fully human, so that they can mess up, so that then you can hold them accountable. But, that accountability piece never happens. And so I grew up, and there would be all kinds of scandals in churches involving pastors and deacons. And, in one situation in particular, I'm thinking about an underage girl. And it just was messy, to use that word. And so I thought, there's no way you can write about the church without writing that. And so it was, very, very natural. But I also wanted to do it with a light hand, and just let that, how do I want to say it? So this is what Pastor Neely did, right? And so there was not a whole lot of commentary around what he was doing, just that he was doing it. And I felt like the reader could bring their own commentary to that. And there was even a moment where he starts to advocate for Olivia to go to the birthday party. And I felt like that was just real, because again, none of us are all terrible, or all, even when we're doing messy things, we can still in those moments do the right thing. And so that was important for me, that it's a type of grace that, we have to show other people, and that I want people to show me. And so I thought it was just important that, because, the book is a critique of the church, it's many things, but that is one. I didn't feel like I needed to be so heavy-handed with it. But definitely to point out that, as people say in the church, these are people with feet of clay, just like me and you.
Absolutely. I love that. I think, one thing that became clear as a recurring theme, and it's a mindset and a response that I study pretty heavily, and that's shame, and the way that we
Mm-hmm.
are working with and against shame. And so I'd love to hear your take on the way that shame is manifesting across different stories, any of your
Mm-hmm.
choosing, where you're seeing mother and daughter relationships, you're seeing
Yeah.
intimate relationships, you're seeing imagined relationships that are kind of based in infatuation and attraction, but never acted upon. All of these moments where shame is either in the background, making you not say anything, or shame is making you cover up that secret a little bit more. How do you
Mm-hmm.
see shame working across the construction of these short stories as a kind of central theme that
Yeah.
pulls together and really amplifies the title, that like that's what makes the secret the secret? I'm avoiding
Right.
some type of shame or some representation that might blur or muddy my church or my family name or myself.
Mm-hmm. So in the class that I'm taking it's a class on sex and faith. We talk about the unholy trinity: fear, shame, and guilt.
Oh
And
wow.
so I kind of think of them as, as the triplets, right? But shame in particular, and its opposite, shameless, right? And so that's almost one of the worst things you can be, is to be shameless. And so shame is a corrective, and it's how you keep people in line, you know? It's how our parents can keep us in line without yelling or laying a finger on us. They could just, you should be ashamed of yourself. Those are powerful words. Or shame. I have loved ones that their shame kept them out of the church. I had relatives say to me, "I'm gonna go to church when I get myself right." And I just remember thinking, and I think I put this in, that might be, I don't know, one of the stories that, it's like, well, isn't church the place where you go to get right? That's what I thought. And so, I think about with Not Daniel, they're not, they're shameless. They're out there, tending to their grief. And then, in Dear Sister, Renee wants Tashida to be ashamed of her very vulgar, very explicit talk around sex, and she's not ashamed. And then Peach Cobbler, that shared shame, right? So you got Olivia, and her mother is doing this shameful thing with the pastor, but then she wears that shame, and then it's amped up because then she has to go to the man's house and see his wife, and and I also think about shame when it comes to instructions for married Christian husbands, and shouldn't a mistress be ashamed? Like, it should be a secret. It should be talked about. And so she is so not ashamed. She's so shameless. She wrote a whole instruction manual.
That was one of my favorite stories. It really took me from this noticing of the church as central to also this being a celebration of women and their power to tell their stories on their own terms, make their own rules. And that, as you mentioned in the beginning about your background with the church, has not always been the role of the woman in the church. We've seen them not be able to take leadership roles until, I would say, maybe the last century, or not even that long, maybe in the last 50 or 60 years, that there has been a more front-facing presence of women in the church.
Yes.
And so when I got to instructions for, I want to make sure instructions for married Christian husbands, I really love the instructive nature of what you were saying. It was like a manual,
Mm-hmm.
I thought about how many people need to read this. I thought also about the ways in which you don't always see women showing up in this, as you said, shameless way, where it's kind of, at least in the church ladies realm, but you see maybe the counter in hip hop or in other secular spaces, in business, where you're saying like, I'm the CEO, I'm the boss. And what it meant to kind of reclaim that space for the secrets of the church ladies, like one, identifying that I sleep with married men, but further that I am in control of this situation and I'm clear about what we're doing, why we're doing it. I think that was such a I must admit, it was so much later in the collection that I was like, oh man, I'm all into my feelings now. And now I'm like ready to fight. I'm like, yeah, that's right. If we're going to travel, you're paying for it. I needed that.
Good.
And so I want to circle back to this idea of like shame and healing and taking space for both and think about how to make love to a physicist as a similar constructive type of moment. And really, I'd like to key in and hear your thoughts about the role of therapy as a taboo space, even today, as we see the wide accessibility of therapy options. I know there's like therapy for a Black girl. There's teletherapy that's been really rising during the pandemic, and so even though we have these larger accesses, and I would even say more access to education around why it's helpful, there's still resistance in certain communities, and perhaps even focused in the church community as far as who's supposed to be counseling you, that you're supposed to seek counsel from for your church leaders. We can occupy space for both. And I remember Yvonne Orji, she did an interview talking about how she has multiple therapists. Like she has a Christian therapist, and she has just secular based therapist that gets her together about the world. And really what you are hoping to do with that, like pushing back against that taboo of therapy, but also that larger piece of that short story of how to make love to a physicist.
That's a different story. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll actually read a little bit from, that's what I want to read from is How to Make Love to a Physicist. But shout out to the Incarnation Institute for Sex and Faith. Their whole mission is around reconciling this idea that faith and sex are not, they're not mutually exclusive. And they work on training therapists in faith and training clergy in mental health so that people don't feel like, I can't be in the church and, seek therapy. But also, I think for the church traditionally, it's been a couple of things. The Black church, therapy is for white people, so there's that. We don't air our dirty laundry as a community. We're not supposed to do that. But also, if you're going to therapy, you can't keep other people's secrets, right? And so that's another reason to discourage therapy.
I was to say that race piece is also mapped on the class. That like it's not only that it's for white people, but it's for white people with money.
Money,
you have a certain profession that like I can't even afford this, And so I think that intersection and tension is so real about even how we access therapy or what it's been associated with.
Right. And we have to remember that mental health is health. And, for Black folks, the medical community, has exploited us and has harmed us historically. So that's another piece that would, create a bit of a barrier. But as you mentioned in How to Make Love to a Physicist, she does go to therapy, and it's not a question. She goes, it's just, a question of like, how is she progressing? But she goes. And so the part that I want to read though is this idea around reconciling faith and science in larger. And so this is an excerpt in the middle of the story. I want to tee it up for those who need context. The author, or not the author, that's me, the narrator, is an art school teacher, and the person that she met at a conference is a physicist, hence the title. And so I'll read a bit from that. How do you make love to a physicist? Ask him if he believes in God. Ask him if he thinks it's possible to reconcile science and religion. Physics principles support the notion of God, he says, because they tell us that you can't create something from nothing. Something must have created all of this. Unless you believe that we have always existed, there's no Big Bang, there's no beginning point to the universe. I don't know what the mechanism is, but it's some higher power. All that energy had to come from somewhere. Oh, I assumed you were an atheist. Even Einstein wasn't an atheist, he says. He talked about God all the time. Now, he didn't believe in a God that was concerned with human behavior, which is the church's obsession and the reason it uses guilt and shame to enforce Christianity. And then she says, you don't think God cares how we treat each other and the planet? I think that's the most important thing, he says. But human beings are capable of doing that outside of the purview of the church. I've studied the Bible cover to cover. So much hinges on translation and interpretation. I grew up Catholic and I love the ritual of it all, but I've come to understand that belief in a personal God is not essential, not for me. You ask, what about heaven? But what you really want to ask is, what about hell? What about it? He says. Heaven, getting into it, avoiding the alternative, is the whole point of living, right? Isn't it? It's the whole point of living right, isn't it? Your mother speaks longingly of Judgment Day and the final accounting of who's allowed past the pearly gates, certain that God's accounting will mirror hers. It will be a very small number, she's fond of saying. Only those who walk the straight and narrow path shall see the face of God. And you realize that if God were to welcome everyone into heaven, your mother would abandon Christianity immediately. You don't know how to answer Eric's question about heaven without sounding like you're quoting a fairy tale about good and evil, reward and punishment. You take a moment to soak it all in. You think of your mother and the very small version of God she clings to, the only version you've ever known, and the one you're afraid to let go of. Then you think of how your daily calls with Eric are a kind of ritual, and how when you finally meet up again, it could be a kind of consecration. You are thrilled and terrified at the prospect. Terrified because all you've ever known of religion is that it demands more than you can ever give. I guess a person could have heaven right here on earth, you say. I do, Eric says. Every time I see you smile or hear you talk about your students, and even when you're quiet and painting or just folding towels. Heaven is me folding towels? Okay, maybe it's you folding fitted sheets. Miracles abound.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. What drew you to want to share that excerpt? What about that excerpt is so important in this moment of officially launching the book,
Yeah.
Of thinking about the ways that it will impact and spark conversations. What really moves you about that piece?
It's such an intimate story. I mean, I think all of the stories are intimate in different ways, but in this moment of quarantine, and so, we're all of us, those of us who are not partnered, this challenge around intimacy, but keeping safe, all of a sudden, things that are talk about your natural desires and you have to squelch them, whether it's platonic or romantic, and have to have this other layer of consideration. And so I really love the intimacy between these two people, and they are long distance. But, eventually they get to see each other and don't have to wear masks and all that kind of stuff. But in the present moment, I'm really, sort of reveling in their ability to be intimate.
I love that. And I agree that there are like so many varying levels of intimacy where you see things happening between mother and daughter, familial structures, whether a parent is deceased, intimate relationships through sex. There's just so much there. And if I had to think of one audience for this text, I could not name just one. As much as I want to say based on the title that, folks in any church setting should have these conversations, to really talk through the power of sharing stories as a means of healing, as a means of reconciliation, as a means of facing and being uncomfortable, seeing the value of that discomfort. As much as I want to say that an aspiring writer should read this text, would be helpful. I would say young people should read this text so that you can begin to, think through specifically young church-going folks. And I think that this is really a different context than thinking about religion, because I think to push back against being churched is a very different thing. As you said, the distinction between your faith and your beliefs, those practices, those spoken and unspoken beliefs. And then there's women. I see like this is as an appeal for women, but I'm curious to hear from you. Who would you like to read this collection of stories? Who did you have in mind when you penned it? Mm-hmm. Who have you thought about in quarantine that might value in experiencing these stories? And what action might you kind of impart on folks as you read, beyond enjoyment? Because as I said, it was totally an enjoyable read, one that I didn't lament or even want to put down. And so I think that you won't have any trouble there. Anyone who's looking to get into something juicy and energizing as a read. But who else might be interested in this collection, and towards what end?
Sure. So when I've heard from Black women readers, who have enjoyed the book, I thank them and I say, I wrote this for us. I really did, because as we've talked about, there is a need for it for us. But it's a text. There are stories that anyone can engage with, anyone who has desires, and that's all of us. Anyone who's ever felt stifled, anyone who's ever had to keep secrets and felt torn between, doing what they feel comes naturally, or doing what their heart longs for, and someone else's disapproval, whether that's someone else's loved one or, their view of God. But I've heard from white folks, I've heard from men and women. Some of the early readers of this book, when the ARC was available, were men who I heard from. So I think that it can reach a lot of people in that respect. But specifically with regard to church folks, absolutely hope that church folks will read it, that they won't be terrified by Eula or upset by Eula, that they won't continue going. And even as I've developed a book club kit with some discussion questions, I've made 2 sets of questions, one for everybody, including church folks, and then a specific group of questions for people who may be doing this with a church Bible study group, or pastors who may want to, figure out how to bring it into discussion. I have a Black woman friend pastor who said, I want to be able to talk to other pastors about this book. And she really inspired me to come up with that second set of questions. So I say, I know enough Bible and church to be dangerous. So I knew some questions that would, speak in their language and meet people kind of where they are, in addition to the other questions. So that book club kit will be available on my website for sure, and possibly on West Virginia University Press's website. It'll be a great resource for folks who want to really dig into the stories with their book club, with their church group, or even just some things to ponder for themselves.
No, I love that. I think that when we, as a people, Black people, can get to a point of understanding the power of critical vulnerability, of looking within for those healing, for the power of the multiplicity of stories, that we don't have a singular narrative, that there are so many things to be uncovered and unveiled through our questions, that our questions are not always doing harm, that they actually gateways and bridges to healing, to progress, and to connection. Then I think that will be a beautiful experience. And I think that this book is the start for so many churches and so many church ladies and so many groups, and just Black women and girls at large. And so I really have enjoyed our conversation here. And I hope that everyone who's listening takes the time to secure a copy of the text and to share it with a friend and to be in conversation. This was a text that is, I think I was in the 3rd story and I was texting a friend like, girl, we got to read this. Like, I have to do this interview for it, but when I'm done, I'm ready. Like, let's have this conversation. And I wanted to call my grandmother and say, like, tell me about some things that you have experienced, and just opening that space for it to even become normalized. And I know there's a trend on social media right now that's like normalize this or normalize that.
Yeah.
And I really want to impart on folks to normalize the sharing of stories as a means of healing and as a means of reconciling with the past and our memory so that we can move forward and towards a better future. So thank you so much, Deesha.
Thank you. Thank you.
This has been my second quarantine treat of the past month as I move into a rather eventful semester. So thank you for the gift of the Secret Lives of Church Ladies. I know that it'll be a gift to so many others.
Well, I really appreciate this conversation. I love what you said about storytelling and asking questions. And now I'm thinking something you said earlier about, why the church and specifically, Christianity, as it's often practiced, is that certainty, right? You do this, you go to heaven. You do this, you go to hell. And so, but that's just not how life works. And so when we focus instead on stories and asking questions, it busts up that notion of certainty, which gives us some stability, but it also gives us a greater freedom too. So thank you for giving me that way to think about these stories, because I hadn't thought about it that way.
Awesome. So glad to have been in conversation with you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Khirsten and Deesha, for delving deep into the complexities, psychologies, and characters beautifully explored in these 9 remarkable stories. And thank you for joining us. Be well, stay safe, and stay connected.